Welcome back to the Grave of the Shadows. Before we begin, a huge thanks for your support. If you love the mystery, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell. Now, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's chilling tale. In 1871, a child was placed into the care of the Finch family of Jennings County, Indiana. He was no ordinary child, but a mystery wrapped in silence. This boy never spoke, never cried, and he never aged. His existence was so strange that even the authorities couldn't comprehend what they were dealing with. The Finch family, once hopeful of providing a home for a child in need, found themselves living with a creature that defied nature and every rule known to man. The story of this boy, now lost to history, has remained largely unknown. His case was buried in forgotten ledgers, dismissed as an anomaly, yet the records tell a tale of a young boy who seemed almost ageless. After 2 years, the Finch family sent him back with no explanation. No formal complaints were made, no visible signs of harm. All they wrote was a cryptic note, "No longer compatible." Years passed, and the child disappeared from the records, leaving nothing behind but unanswered questions. Yet, decades later, a prison intake sheet was found, listing a child who appeared identical in every way. Same name, same age, and still, impossibly, only 9 years old. This is not a ghost story. It's a story of a child who left an indelible mark on the people around him and on the records that were supposed to define his life. Who was this boy? What was he? And why did the authorities fail to explain the mysteries surrounding him? As we step into the world of the Finch family, we delve into a century-old enigma, a case that was never fully resolved. It's a story of secrecy, bureaucracy, and something even stranger, a boy whose science couldn't explain. Join us as we uncover the strange, forgotten records of the boy whose age remained the same, despite the passage of decades. But before we begin, if you're intrigued, hit like and subscribe. You won't want to miss what we find next. In the year 1871, Jennings County, Indiana, was a place where history often went unnoticed, and forgotten stories were buried under layers of time. The Finch family, a modest and childless couple, had a stable home and a steady income. Elijah, a former schoolmaster, and Miriam, a seamstress, had little reason to expect that their quiet lives would soon be disrupted by a child who defied the very laws of nature. The Indiana foster care system, still in its infancy, had seen little regulation or oversight. In the aftermath of the Civil War, many children were placed into the care of families like the Finches under state programs designed to provide stability. These children were often passed from home to home, their lives recorded in dusty ledgers that would remain largely unexamined for decades. But the child that arrived at the Finch household was unlike any other. The state orphan registry, a key part of the child welfare system, had very few records for the children it placed. Names were often missing, ages were estimated, and the entries were sparse. It was a system built more on trust and efficiency than one designed to preserve history. When the Finch family accepted the boy into their home, they were unaware that they were stepping into a story that would echo through time. The boy, placed with the family under the state's foster care program, had no name on his records, just a simple, cryptic code, 13B. He had no known origin, no history, and no information about his past. The state's child welfare system deemed him speechless and silent, but they offered no explanation as to why. The boy seemed to have no memories of his past life, nor did he show any signs of age, despite his reported 9 years. For the Finches, this was not just a child placed into their care. It was a mystery that unfolded in their home. Miriam's sewing journal, found later, contained only vague references to the child. Sleeve narrow, boy 3 done. Each entry echoed with the strangeness of the child, but the couple made no formal complaints. The boy's presence, though peculiar, did not seem to cause any disruption in their lives. As the months passed, the child's behavior became even more unsettling. He never spoke, he never cried, and most disturbingly, he never aged. Elijah's journal entries, scattered with odd phrases, reflect his growing unease. He does not speak. He knows when I enter, Elijah wrote. I have stopped knocking. Miriam, in her journal, noted, "He rises before the stove is lit." For the Finches, these small observations painted a picture of a child who was not of this world, whose existence didn't fit into the boundaries of time or reason. On a warm July day in 1871, a boy arrived at the Finch family's doorstep. The child was not delivered with fanfare or any sense of urgency, but with a quiet that would come to define his entire existence. There were no official greetings, no social worker explaining his needs or background. He simply appeared in the hands of a state-appointed agent, his past a mystery, and his future uncertain. The boy's records were startlingly sparse, even for the orphan registry of the time. There was no name, no age, no history. The child was listed only as 13B, a placeholder in the cold, bureaucratic system. The state's child welfare system, overwhelmed and understaffed after the war, often left records incomplete or unclear. For this boy, it seemed the system had failed to even provide a complete identification. Elijah and Miriam Finch, a childless couple with a stable income and a solid reputation, were the recipients of this enigmatic child. Though they had hoped for a child to raise and love, they quickly realized that this boy was not like the others they had known or cared for. He didn't cry when hungry, he didn't laugh when amused, and most perplexingly, he never spoke. The boy's silence was not that of a mute child. There was an eerie stillness about him, a calm that seemed unnatural. He would sit for hours, never shifting, his eyes watching the world around him with unnerving focus. The Finches, who had lived their quiet lives in rural Indiana, were unprepared for such a strange child, and yet they never questioned him, nor did they ask the state for a reason behind his oddities. Miriam kept a sewing journal during this time, and it would become an unexpected record of her strange observations about the boy. She wrote of him in passing, as though he were just another part of their daily routine, though her notes suggest otherwise. "Sleeve narrow, boy. 3 done," she wrote, referring to a pattern she had sewn for him, but there were no other measurements or details. The entries were cryptic, and over time, they became more unsettling. "He does not cry, he does not speak. He rises before the stove is lit. His eyes rest between mine and the wall." Elijah's journals mirrored this growing confusion. He would write, "He does not speak. He knows when I enter. I have stopped knocking." These small, unsettling details revealed that something was deeply wrong, though the Finches could not put their finger on it. The boy seemed to exist outside of time. He did not age, did not grow taller, and his appearance remained unchanged, even after months under their care. For all their observations, the Finches remained passive, accepting of the boy's silent, unchanging presence in their home. Soon, Elijah and Miriam would discover that their quiet, uneventful life was being turned upside down by this boy who was beyond explanation, and the mystery of his existence would only grow deeper with time. As time passed, the mystery of the boy deepened, and the strange inconsistencies in his records became increasingly difficult to ignore. What was once an oddity in the quiet life of the Finch family now seemed to stretch beyond the ordinary, challenging every assumption about what was possible. The boy's records, or rather, the lack thereof, stood as a silent testament to the bizarre nature of his existence. The first red flag came from the state orphanage's intake ledger. The boy's file, if it could even be called a file, was woefully incomplete. Under the section for personal information, there was nothing but a cryptic code, 13B. There was no name, no birthplace, and no birthdate, just the impersonal number. The boy, it seemed, was not supposed to exist in any conventional sense. His very identity was erased from the system. The intake notes made only one mention of his condition. No speech, no resistance, no name is given. What struck the Finches most was that the state orphanage had placed no emphasis on this child's oddities. Normally, such cases would be flagged, requiring further investigation. But here, in the official records, there was no mention of the boy's strange behavior or his lack of aging. He was simply another entry in an overburdened system, placed quietly into the Finch household with little oversight. It was almost as though the system had accepted him without question, as though it were accustomed to children who defied logic. The next set of records, from the orphanage's annual report was just as unsettling. Despite the fact that Elijah had testified in a later deposition that they had received the boy with proper documentation and a food allowance, the report made no mention of his transfer to the Finch home. There was no formal record of any child being placed in their care in the year 1871, let alone one who was listed as 13B. Yet the Finches clearly recalled the child arriving with documents in hand, as was required by the state. As they dug deeper, Elijah and Miriam found more discrepancies. The entries in their journals, full of strange references to the boy's behavior, began to contradict the official records. Miriam's journal, for example, mentioned a child who never spoke and never cried, but there were no references in the official intake forms to any abnormality in his development. Instead, the orphanage records continued to list him as silent, a vague term that seemed to sweep the issue under the rug, almost as though they were trying to ignore his unusual condition. Elijah's writing also betrayed his growing unease. In one journal entry, he noted, "He knows when I enter. I have stopped knocking." This was a disturbing realization for Elijah. His once quiet home was now filled with a constant reminder of the boy's strange abilities. The boy was not just silent. He was aware of everything around him, almost unervingly so. This kind of awareness was not typical of a child of his age. Yet, there was no investigation, no attempt by the authorities to look deeper into his unusual presence. The more the Finches looked at the records, the more they realized that the boy was not merely an anomaly. He was a riddle wrapped in layers of unspoken history. His existence challenged the very foundation of the system that had placed him with them. And yet, no one seemed to care. As the boy's time with the Finches continued, the unanswered questions piled up, each one more unsettling than the last. As the mystery surrounding the boy deepened, the Finches found themselves turning to the archives for answers. They began to dig through the few surviving records, desperately trying to find something, anything, that could explain the boy's existence. What they uncovered was both puzzling and unsettling, documents that offered more questions than answers. The first set of records they discovered was the original orphan intake ledger from Jennings County. It was here that they found the cryptic code 13B, the boy's only identifier. But what stood out even more were the notes surrounding his entry. The child was listed as having no speech and no resistance. No further details were provided. But there was something eerie about the way the information was recorded. The entry seemed rushed, as though the clerk had quickly filled in the space without a second thought. The lack of details wasn't unusual for the time, but for the Finches, it felt like an intentional omission. Next, the Finches uncovered a photograph, one of the few that had survived the passing decades. The image, a black and white portrait of the boy, showed him seated rigidly on a velvet chair. His eyes, though wide, were unervingly still, as though frozen in time. The back of the photograph was embossed with the name of a photographer from Madison, Indiana, a man whose studio had burned down under mysterious circumstances just 2 years after the photograph was taken. This was the only known image of the boy, and it was as chilling as it was enigmatic. The portrait became a key piece of evidence for the Finches. The boy's unchanging appearance was now visually documented. The photograph, unlike most images of children from the era, had no signs of aging or deterioration. The edges were still crisp, and the image was clear and sharp. There were no cracks, no fading, nothing that would normally indicate the passage of time. The Finches were left with the unsettling realization that the boy's image, like his existence, was impervious to the ravages of time. Digging further, they found additional records that only deepened the mystery. The orphanage's annual reports from 1871 made no mention of a child placed in the Finch household, despite Elijah's earlier testimony. These omissions were strange, too strange to be mere oversight. The child's arrival at the Finch home was not recorded in any public document, and his name never appeared in any official reports. This discrepancy raised an alarming question. If the boy had been placed with the Finches, why were there no records? Why was he erased from the system? The search through these archives led to a grim realization. It wasn't just the boy's past that was missing, so was any trace of his future. There were no follow-up reports, no reassignment papers, and no indication of where the boy had gone after he was returned to the orphanage. It was as if he had simply vanished from the world, leaving behind only fragments of a life that never truly existed in the records. Each document the Finches uncovered added more weight to the mystery, and yet, every new discovery seemed to pull them further from the truth. They were faced with an enigma, a boy who had no name, no past, and no future in the records. He existed, but only in the shadows of forgotten paperwork and lost photographs. And with each archival discovery, the shadow grew longer, darker, and more impenetrable. As the years passed, the Finch family's lives were increasingly overshadowed by the presence of the silent boy. Yet, despite the growing tension and the strange behavior exhibited by the child, the Finches made no formal complaints. It was as though they had quietly accepted the boy's peculiarities, choosing to live in a state of uneasy coexistence with the mystery that had entered their home. However, it was through their personal accounts, particularly the journals and testimonies of Elijah and Miriam, that the full extent of the boy's strange nature began to surface. Elijah, a former schoolmaster, was typically a man of reason and order, yet the journals he kept during this time were full of unsettling reflections. He wrote of the boy's silent presence, his eerie stillness, and the growing unease he felt. In one entry, Elijah noted, "He does not speak. He knows when I enter. I have stopped knocking." These words were not the reflections of a man simply recounting the behavior of a quiet child. They were the thoughts of someone deeply disturbed by a presence that defied reason. Elijah's growing anxiety about the boy's unnatural awareness of his surroundings was evident in the repetition of certain phrases. The boy's silence was not the absence of sound but the presence of something else, something unexplainable. Miriam's sewing journal provided further insight into the bizarre nature of the boy's behavior. Though it contained primarily household records, there were increasingly frequent mentions of the child. Miriam recorded his actions in odd, almost cryptic detail. "Sleeve narrow, boy. 3 done," she wrote, referring to a pattern she had sewn for him. There were no measurements, no further explanation, just these brief notes that seemed to carry a weight far beyond the mundane. Her observations grew more haunting with time. "He rises before the stove is lit," she wrote in one entry. "His eyes rest between mine and the wall." Miriam, too, seemed unsettled, though she never explicitly questioned the boy's presence. Instead, her journal entries suggested an acceptance of his silence, of his unchanging existence within their home. Despite the strange behavior of the child, neither Elijah nor Miriam ever made any formal complaints to the authorities. Their journals, written in a mixture of confusion and quiet acceptance, were perhaps the only records that captured the true essence of their time with the boy. They never sought answers from the state. They never asked why the boy didn't age, why he never spoke, or why he seemed to be so disturbingly aware of everything around him. The Finches accepted his silence, but in doing so, they became complicit in a story that would forever remain incomplete. Their testimony, both written and unspoken, painted a picture of a family caught in the grip of something they couldn't understand, yet something they were unwilling to confront. It was not until later, when the boy was returned to the orphanage, that the true significance of the Finches' experience would begin to unravel. And even then, the boy's presence would linger in their memories, in the journals they left behind, and in the strange silence that seemed to envelop their home for years to come. The passage of time is something we all experience. Children grow, their faces change, their bodies mature, and the years etch their marks on them. But the boy in question, the one placed with the Finch family in 1871, defied this natural progression. Despite being listed as 9 years old when he arrived, his appearance remained eerily unchanged throughout his time with the Finches, and even in the years that followed. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence in this case was the photograph of the boy, which became a key element in the investigation. It was the only known image of him, an old, black-and-white portrait taken in the early 1870s. The photograph, found years later tucked between papers in the Finch estate, showed the boy seated on a velvet chair. His posture was rigid, his hands neatly folded in his lap, his eyes wide and unblinking. There was no smile, no expression, just an unsettling stillness that made the image almost haunting. What struck those who later examined the photograph was not just the boy's expression, but the fact that the image showed no signs of aging. Unlike most photographs from that era, which often displayed signs of wear and fading over time, this one remained unusually clear. The paper itself was pristine, the edges crisp, and the details sharp. Even the creases of the boy's shirt were visible, as though the photograph had been taken just moments before. This pristine quality raised immediate questions. How could a photograph taken over a century ago remain so fresh? How could the boy in the photograph appear unchanged despite the many years that had passed? The photograph became even more unsettling when compared to the records later discovered. In an intake sheet dated decades after the boy's original placement with the Finches, a new photograph surfaced, one that depicted a boy with the same posture, the same facial expression, and the same clothes, impossibly identical. This photo, taken years later in a different county, was dated 14 months after the original. Yet, the boy's appearance had not changed. His age, despite the passage of time, remained frozen at 9. This was not just a case of a child who looked the same in two photographs taken close together. This was a phenomenon where time itself seemed to stand still. The boy's clothes, even the scuff marks on his shoes, matched perfectly between the two photographs. His posture, though subtly rigid, was identical in both images. It was as if the same boy had posed for both photographs, yet years apart, an impossibility given the natural aging process. The more the Finches and later investigators looked at the photographs, the more they became convinced that this child existed outside of time. He did not simply resist the effects of aging, he seemed impervious to them. No amount of time, no number of years, could alter his appearance. His existence, captured so clearly in these photographs, stood as an unyielding testament to a mystery that no one could explain. With each passing day, the boy's unchanged appearance only deepened the mystery. The photographs did not just document his face, they marked the passage of time, or rather, the absence of it. As the boy's physical form remained static, the world around him changed, yet he remained forever locked in a state of unyielding youth. After 2 years of living with the Finch family, the boy was unexpectedly returned to the state orphanage. It was an event that seemed almost as inexplicable as the child's arrival in the first place. Elijah and Miriam Finch, who had grown accustomed to the silent child's peculiarities, were suddenly faced with the reality of letting him go. The reasons behind his return were never fully explained, leaving only the terse note written on the intake form, "No longer compatible." This phrase, so stark and final, seemed entirely out of place in the context of an orphanage system that typically dealt with issues of illness, abuse, or neglect. In most cases, children were returned to the orphanage due to problems such as behavioral issues or a lack of proper care. But the note that accompanied this boy's return made no mention of any such concerns. There were no complaints, no injuries, and no reports of abuse or neglect. There was only the cryptic phrase, "No longer compatible." The return was, as expected, formalized in the state's records, but the entries were riddled with anomalies. The orphanage's intake sheet listed the child as no name, no known origin, no age. And yet, his face remained frozen in time, unaltered by the 2 years spent with the Finches. His presence, it seemed, was recorded and erased from the state's archives with equal indifference. His name had never been written down, and now, his return was logged with as little fanfare as his arrival had been. Elijah and Miriam, despite their growing unease, did not protest. The boy's silent, unyielding gaze had become a part of their daily lives. Yet there was something deeply unsettling about his departure. They had grown attached to him in their own way, but they also realized that they could never truly know him. He was a child who did not grow, did not speak, and did not belong to the world they understood. In their journals, there were no words of regret, only quiet acceptance. "He does not speak. He does not cry. He knows when I enter," Elijah wrote in his final journal entry about the boy. When the child was returned, there was no dramatic farewell. No emotional scene marked the end of his time with the Finches. He was simply handed over, as if he had never truly belonged to them. The boy was taken back to the orphanage, his records updated with a simple, bureaucratic note that offered no explanation for his strange condition. His file was closed, and the child disappeared from the system once again, no longer an enigma, just another entry in a forgotten ledger. Yet, the mystery did not end there. The orphanage staff had no clear explanation for why the boy had been returned. They had no knowledge of his strange abilities, nor did they seem to question why he had not aged in the 2 years he had spent with the Finches. It was as though they, too, were willing to accept the boy's existence without seeking answers. His case, like so many others, was swept into the background of an overburdened system, relegated to the archives and forgotten. As the years passed, the boy's time with the Finches seemed to fade into the background, buried beneath the weight of other records, other stories. But the questions remained. What happened to the boy after his return? Why had he never aged? And what was the true nature of his existence? As the years passed and the boy was returned to the orphanage, the unanswered questions only grew. The gaps in the records, the conflicting testimonies, and the lack of any real explanation for the boy's existence created a web of mystery that seemed impossible to untangle. The boy's case, it seemed, was one that no one wanted to investigate too deeply, perhaps because it defied all logic. And yet, the more one looked at the details, the clearer it became that something extraordinary had occurred, something no one could fully explain. The orphanage's records were full of inconsistencies, starting with the initial intake form. The boy was listed under the code 13B, but there was no mention of where he had come from or who had placed him with the Finches. His name was never written, his age was estimated, and his condition was described simply as silent. Such vague entries were not unusual for the time, but the absence of more detailed information about the boy was highly suspicious. It was as if someone had intentionally erased any trace of his origin, leaving behind only an empty space. Elijah Finch's testimony about the boy was equally perplexing. In his deposition, he recalled receiving the child with proper documentation and allowances. But when he looked at the records, there was no official mention of the boy's arrival in 1871. There was no formal acknowledgement that the boy had been placed with the Finches at all. It was as though he had never been there, as if the boy's existence had been scrubbed from the state's archives. Despite these discrepancies, the authorities seemed uninterested in investigating further. The case of the boy was left to fester in the shadows, unexamined and forgotten. No one questioned why a child who appeared to be 9 years old was still unaging after 2 years. No one wondered why the boy's records were so incomplete, and no one tried to uncover the mystery of his identity. The system, it seemed, was content to let this anomaly slip through the cracks. The most disturbing inconsistency was the term used in the boy's return records, no longer compatible. This phrase was unlike any other reason listed for a child's return in the orphanage records. Normally, children were returned due to behavioral issues, illness, or neglect. But compatibility? That term was not found in any official guidelines or forms used by the state orphanage. It was as if a new category had been created just for this boy, one that had no real definition. As investigators combed through the files, they found no explanation for this unusual terminology. It didn't match the language used in any of the other orphanage records from that period. In fact, the return of this boy seemed to break all the rules of the system. The return reason was vague, and there was no follow-up or inquiry into his strange behavior. There was no official investigation into why he had never aged. The records simply ended, and the boy was forgotten by the system. This lack of explanation only raised more questions. Was the boy a failed experiment, a child who had been lost in a system that couldn't understand him? Or was there something more to his story, something that no one was willing to confront? The inconsistencies in the records were just the beginning. What lay beneath them, in the spaces between the lines, was a mystery that had never been fully explored. The unanswered questions, the missing documents, the cryptic terminology. It all pointed to a case that had been swept under the rug, ignored by those who should have sought the truth. The boy's story remained untold, his existence buried in records that seemed to lead nowhere. But somewhere, In the forgotten pages of history, the truth waited to be uncovered. With each new discovery, the questions surrounding the boy grew more complex, and the search for answers seemed increasingly futile. Yet, as with any unsolved mystery, theories began to emerge. These hypotheses ranged from the plausible to the fantastical, each attempting to explain the unexplainable nature of the boy and his existence. What or who was he? Could he be a product of a bizarre medical experiment, or perhaps something more supernatural? Was he simply the result of an elaborate bureaucratic failure, an oversight in a broken system? One theory that emerged from the records was that the boy might have been the subject of some kind of medical experiment, an early attempt to explore the boundaries of human development. Given his peculiar lack of aging and his strange behaviors, some speculated that he was part of a study designed to understand the effects of prolonged childhood without normal developmental milestones. However, no evidence surfaced to support this theory, no known medical records, no researchers' notes, nothing in the state archives. The idea seemed plausible, but without further proof, it remained a mere possibility, grounded more in speculation than fact. Another, more supernatural theory suggested that the boy could have been the result of some unknown, otherworldly phenomenon. His unchanging appearance, combined with his odd behavior, led some to believe that he was not bound by the same rules of time that governed ordinary humans. Could he have been a being from another realm or dimension, perhaps even a ghost or a spirit trapped in a child's body? This idea, though highly speculative, found its place among those who found the boy's lack of aging impossible to reconcile with science. The concept of time as an unchanging constant was challenged by the boy's existence, leading some to ponder the possibility of his being something beyond human comprehension. Others, perhaps more grounded in reality, considered the possibility that the boy's story was simply the result of an unfortunate bureaucratic error. Perhaps, they speculated, the records had been lost, misfiled, or altered over time. The boy might have been caught in the system's inefficiencies, a casualty of an overworked child welfare department unable to keep track of its charges. This theory suggested that the boy's unchanging nature might have been overlooked, with those responsible too busy to notice his strange condition. His silence, too, could have been misinterpreted as a behavioral issue, leading to a lack of investigation into his true nature. This theory, while mundane, would account for the lack of documentation and the ambiguous return form, though it failed to explain the boy's unnatural stillness and unaging appearance. The most unsettling theory, however, suggested that the boy's existence was part of a larger, more sinister pattern, one in which the state orphanage had been involved in something far darker than simple neglect. Could the child have been part of an experiment in control, a living anomaly that was manipulated by those who ran the system? The idea that the boy might have been deliberately altered or even created for some unknown purpose sent chills through those who considered it. What if his strange nature was the result of deliberate intervention, an experiment gone wrong, or a plan that was never fully realized? The lack of records and the mysterious return only fueled this theory, raising the possibility that the boy had been part of a larger, far-reaching scheme. Despite these various theories, no one could say for certain what had happened to the boy, or why he had been returned to the orphanage in such an enigmatic way. His story remained a closed book, a riddle that refused to be solved. As the years passed, the theories became just that, speculations that offered no real answers, only possibilities. Each theory, while intriguing, failed to fully explain the child's strange, unchanging nature, leaving behind a haunting question that no one had yet been able to answer. What was the boy? As we reach the end of this mysterious journey, the boy's story remains as enigmatic as it was when it first began. Despite the records, the photographs, and the testimonies, the questions surrounding his existence still linger in the shadows, unanswered and unresolved. Who was he? What was he? And why did he seem so impervious to the normal passage of time? These questions continue to haunt anyone who encounters the strange tale of the child who never aged. The boy's case is not just a tale of an anomaly. It is a story about the limitations of human understanding. Science and reason, which are often seen as the ultimate tools for solving mysteries, failed to explain the inexplicable nature of the boy's existence. The medical explanations were insufficient, the bureaucratic records incomplete, and the theories ranged from the plausible to the paranormal. Yet, no matter how much time has passed, no one has been able to fully comprehend the true nature of the boy who defied time itself. What makes the boy's story so haunting is not just the unanswered questions, but the implications of those questions. If we are to believe that his strange condition was not the result of medical anomaly or bureaucratic failure, then what does that say about the boundaries of time, life, and existence? Was he merely a product of a broken system, or was there something deeper at play? Something beyond the grasp of ordinary people and even science itself? For Elijah and Miriam Finch, the boy's time with them was a brief yet profound chapter in their lives. They accepted him without questioning his origins, his silence, or his strange, unchanging nature. Perhaps they, too, recognized that some things were simply beyond their understanding. As time passed and the boy was returned to the orphanage, their lives went back to normal. But the mystery of the boy never truly left them. His silent presence, his unnerving stillness, lingered in their memories long after he was gone. In the end, the boy's fate is as elusive as the answers to his mystery. We may never know who he truly was or what happened to him after he was returned. The archives, the photographs, and the records may offer some clues, but they cannot provide closure. And so, the boy remains, a figure caught in the shifting tides of history, forever frozen in time. The truth of the boy's story may remain hidden forever. Perhaps he was simply an anomaly, an oddity that never truly fit into the world as we understand it. Or perhaps he was something more, something beyond human comprehension. Regardless of the answer, his legacy lives on in the unanswered questions, the forgotten records, and the strange silence that still surrounds his life. As we close the chapter on the mysterious boy, one question remains: what really happened to him? His story is an unsettling reminder that some mysteries may never be solved. But that doesn't mean we stop searching for answers. History is filled with questions like this one, stories that never fully unfold, and truths that stay hidden in the shadows of time. If you've been captivated by this story, make sure to like this video and subscribe to The Grave of the Shadows for more spine-chilling tales of the unknown. Don't forget to hit that bell so you're notified whenever we uncover new historical mysteries. There are countless other stories just like this one. Stories that have been buried in the past, waiting for someone to dig them up and bring them to light. And if you're still with us, leave a comment below and tell us what you think happened to the boy. Do you believe there's a logical explanation for his unchanging nature? Or do you think he was part of something more supernatural? Maybe you have your own theories. We'd love to hear them. Remember, we're all in this together, uncovering the forgotten past, piece by piece. The more you interact, the more we'll be able to bring these eerie, unsolved stories into the light. So, share this video with your friends, and let's continue the hunt for the answers to mysteries that have stood the test of time. Until next time, keep your curiosity sharp and your lights dim. Who knows what we'll uncover next?